Tonight, we're setting sail for the Caribbean, to an era of wooden ships, iron men, and a black flag that promised a life of freedom and fortune. We're going to talk about the Golden Age of Piracy. You already know the legend, Jack Sparrow. Blackbeard, buried treasures marked with an X, bottles of rum, sea shanties, and a life of endless adventure on the blue sea. The pirate is the ultimate rebel, the romantic anarchist who spits in the face of society, lives by his own rules, and dies in a blaze of glory. It's an intoxicating fantasy, and like all good fantasies, it's built on a mountain of half-truths and convenient lies, because the real life of a pirate wasn't a Disney adventure. It was, in most cases, a short, brutal, and profoundly unpleasant career that ended not with a chest full of gold doubloons, but with a rope around the neck, a cannonball in the chest, or more likely, a slow and pathetic death from disease and malnutrition. Tonight, we're climbing aboard a real pirate ship. We're going to smell the stench of the bilge, taste the weevil-infested food, and understand why for most of these men, freedom was just another name for a death sentence that lasted, on average, about 2 years. So forget the treasure maps. The true story of piracy is much dirtier and a lot less fun. Who became a pirate and why? They weren't idealistic adventurers. The vast majority were desperate men fleeing from something, and that something was the life of a common sailor in the Merchant Marine or the Royal Navy. Imagine you're a young sailor on an English merchant ship in the early 18th century. Your life is a floating hell. The ship is overcrowded and unsanitary. You sleep in a cramped hammock in a space with no ventilation. The food is a monotony of rock-hard biscuits, often shared with weevils, and salted meat so tough you could use it to repair the hull. The work is exhausting and dangerous. You spend your days climbing the masts in the middle of storms, handling rough ropes that tear your hands apart, and performing endless maintenance. One slip, one unexpected wave, and you disappear into the ocean. No one will stop to look for you. And then there's the discipline. The captain is an absolute tyrant. His word is law. For the slightest infraction, you can be flogged with the cat-o'-nine-tails, a whip that tears the skin from your back. And the pay is miserable, and it's often stolen from you or denied at the end of the voyage. You are, for all intents and purposes, a wage slave. Or worse, you could be pressed into service in the Royal Navy. One day you're in a tavern, and the next you wake up with a monumental headache in the hold of a warship, forced to serve the king for an indefinite time. So, one day, in some Caribbean port, you see a different ship, a ship with a black flag, and the men on that ship make you an offer. They don't offer you a wage, they offer you a share, an equal part of the loot. They offer you the right to vote for the captain, for the next destination, for the ship's rules. They offer you a life without floggings, without tyranny. They offer you freedom. For a man who has known nothing but oppression, that offer is irresistible. So you sign the ship's articles, the pirate code, and join the Brotherhood. You've just escaped a floating prison. What you don't know is that you've just boarded another. Life on a pirate ship was, in many ways, a radical utopia. It was one of the most democratic societies in the world at the time. The captain wasn't a dictator. He was elected and could be deposed by a simple vote if the crew was unhappy with his leadership. His authority was absolute, only during battle. In all other matters, the crew had the final say. The loot was divided in a surprisingly equitable way. A common sailor received one share. The captain, the quartermaster, and other officers received a bit more, maybe a share and a half or two, but nothing compared to the abysmal wealth gap on a merchant ship. Injuries were compensated. Losing an eye or a leg in battle entitled you to an extra share of the loot, a kind of primitive disability insurance. It was a multicultural and often surprisingly integrated society. A pirate ship's crew could include English, French, Dutch, freed Africans, Native Americans. No one cared about your background as long as you could fight and follow the code. But this democratic utopia was floating on a sea of misery. Pirate ships weren't majestic galleons. They were often small, fast sloops, stolen and refitted. They were overcrowded, with 80 or 100 men living in a space designed for 30. Hygiene was non-existent. The stench of the bilge, a mixture of stagnant water, garbage, and human waste, permeated every wooden plank. Rats and cockroaches were your constant companions, and the food was, if possible, even worse than in the merchant navy. Pirates had no regular supply routes. They ate what they could plunder, and when the loot was scarce, it was back to hardtack and salted meat. Fresh water was the most valuable resource, and it often went foul in the barrels, turning green and slimy. And this brings us to the real killer of the Golden Age of piracy. It wasn't the cannons of the Royal Navy. It was a slow, insidious, and deeply unpleasant disease, scurvy. On a long voyage without access to fresh fruits and vegetables, your body runs out of vitamin C, and the results are horrific. It starts with a feeling of fatigue and weakness. Then your gums begin to swell and bleed. They turn black, spongy. Your teeth loosen until you can pull them out with your fingers. Old scars reopen. Your skin becomes covered in bruises. You feel unbearable pain in your joints. And finally, you die, either from internal bleeding or a secondary infection. It's not a hero's death. It's a pathetic death, where your body slowly falls apart in the middle of the ocean. Besides scurvy, there were venereal diseases rampant in the brothels of pirate ports, and tropical fevers like malaria and yellow fever, transmitted by mosquitoes on the swampy islands where they hid. Your body was in a constant war, and it often lost. The image of the pirate fighting in an epic sword battle is, for the most part, a myth. Pirates didn't want to fight. Fighting was dangerous, and it damaged the product, the ship they wanted to capture. Their main tactic was terror. They would hoist the Jolly Roger, the black flag with the skull and crossbones. The message was clear: surrender now, and we might spare your lives. Fight, and there will be no mercy. They would often fire a cannon volley, not at the hull, but at the masts and sails to cripple the ship. And then they would board. Boarding was a chaos of screams, pistol shots, and the clash of cutlasses, but it rarely lasted long. Most merchant crews, poorly paid and with no loyalty to their captains, surrendered quickly. Why die for a cargo of sugar that wasn't yours? But if a fight did happen, it was brutal. Wooden splinters from a cannonball were as lethal as the ball itself. Cutlasses weren't elegant fencing weapons. They were butcher knives designed to amputate limbs. And if you were wounded, well, pray the wound was mortal. The ship's surgeon was often the cook or the carpenter, the man who knew how to cut meat or wood. There was no anesthesia, save for a generous dose of rum. Surgery was a quick and dirty amputation. They held you down, gave you a piece of leather to bite on, and the surgeon sawed off your leg or arm with a bone saw. The wound was cauterized with a red-hot iron, or more commonly, hot tar. The pain was so extreme that many died of shock, and if you survived the operation, infection was almost a certainty. In such a filthy environment, gangrene was the most likely outcome. And what happened if you were successful? If you captured a ship full of treasure, the loot was taken to the nearest pirate port, like Nassau, and there it was spent. Spent with a speed and debauchery that defy logic. Imagine you've just spent months at sea, eating Weevily biscuits and dodging death. Suddenly, Your pocket is full of gold. What do? Invest it wisely in a retirement plan? No. You spend it all on alcohol, on gambling, in the brothels. For 1 week, you live like a king. And then, when the money runs out, you go back to sea to start the cycle all over again. The idea of the pirate retiring to a tropical island with his treasure is, for the most part, a fantasy. Most died before they got the chance, and those who survived often ended up poor, sick, or hanged. The average career of a pirate was 1 to 3 years. Blackbeard, the most feared of all, lasted only 2 years. Calico Jack Rackham, less than 2. Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful, barely 3. The Golden Age of Piracy was a brief and violent explosion. It was a desperate rebellion against an oppressive system, but it was a rebellion with no future. So, who was the real pirate? He wasn't a romantic hero. He was an ordinary man pushed into a desperate life by an unjust world. He created a surprisingly democratic society on his ship, but that society floated on an ocean of brutality, disease, and near certain death. He fought for freedom, yes, but the freedom he found was often the freedom to die young. His story isn't a fun adventure. It's a tragedy. It's a reminder that behind every romantic myth, there's usually a reality of human suffering. It shows us how people, when pushed to the limit, can create their own rules, their own justice, even if that new world is just as dangerous as the one they left behind. The next time you see a pirate flag, don't just think of treasure and adventure. Think of the anonymous sailor with his gums bleeding from scurvy, his body scarred by the whip, who saw in that black flag his only desperate chance to be, even if just for a brief and terrible moment, a free man.